I found out my child's daycare was letting kids sit in dirty diapers for hours, barely feeding them, and staff were scrolling on their phones instead of watching the kids. The moment I saw it with my own eyes, I pulled my child out immediately and reported them. The call came last Thursday, shattering my world in an instant. My daughter's daycare was on fire. I raced there, my heart pounding in my ears, only to arrive and see them already loading my little Gabriella into an ambulance. The sight of her was like a punch to the gut. Vicious burns covered her ears and neck, and she had an oxygen mask on. But what truly twisted my stomach was the horrifying detail I almost missed. She seemed to be the only child seriously hurt. Every other kid was just fine, maybe a little dust, a scratch or two, but nothing more. I scrambled into the ambulance with her, and during that terrifying ride to the hospital, her heart rate plummeted. It dropped to a quarter of what it should be. She started turning purple. We barely made it, and they rushed her straight to the back. For 7 agonizing hours I waited alone with no news. When the doctors finally returned, their faces grim, they told me Gabriella was gone. Not gone, but the Gabriella I knew, the one who laughed and ran, she was gone. The lack of oxygen had caused severe brain damage. She was in a coma, and though they said she'd likely wake up, they warned me to prepare for permanent damage. 25% chance she'd come out normal. 25%. That night, as I sat by her bedside, lost in a haze of grief, the paramedic who brought her in sat next to me. He said, "Sir, I need to tell you something." My eyes, already swollen, widened as he continued. "We found your daughter in the employee bathroom at the daycare. The door was closed. She was the only child left in the entire building." His words swirled, not making sense at first, and then with a sickening clarity they clicked into place. Someone put Gabriella in there. Someone locked her in. Someone left her to burn. The next morning, a cold fury burning in my gut, I confronted Mrs. Hamilton, the daycare owner. She was at her second location, shuffling papers, looking utterly unbothered. I expected shock, outrage, a promise to investigate. But when I asked her why Gabriella was in that locked bathroom, she just kept pushing papers around. "Unfortunate events happen in emergencies. People panic," she said, her voice flat. Then she looked up, her eyes like ice. "And you're no saint either. You're always 15 minutes late for pickup. My staff is exhausted dealing with parents like you." My jaw literally dropped. Was she serious? She actually said, "Your daughter has always been extremely difficult. Maybe someone just needed 5 minutes of peace." And coincidentally, the fire started. 5 minutes of peace. That's what my baby's brain damage was worth to her. My whole body shook with rage as I stumbled back to my car. As I was leaving, another parent, Lisa, her 4-year-old Grace, was in the toddler room, called out to me. She looked so nervous. "I heard about Gabriella." "I'm so sorry," she started, then her voice dropped. "But I need to tell you something. Grace keeps having nightmares about the fire. She says she saw Mr. Victor carrying a baby into the staff bathroom right before the smoke started. She heard crying and then the door closed." My knees buckled. Victor, the afternoon aide who always volunteered for diaper duty. That afternoon, I waited by Maria's car. She was another daycare worker. When she saw me, she tried to turn away, but I called out, my voice raw. "Maria, please. My daughter has brain damage. I need to know what happened." She looked around the empty parking lot. Then her shoulders sagged in defeat. "Victor. He takes babies into that bathroom and locks the door. We hear them crying, but we can't get in. We told Mrs. Hamilton, but Victor is her nephew. She said to mind our business or we'd lose our jobs." Maria's voice trembled. The day of the fire, when the alarm went off, Victor ran out of that bathroom alone and slammed the door behind him. I asked if all the kids were out and he said yes. But his face was white, and his hands were shaking. "He left your baby in there to burn because he couldn't explain why he had her locked in that bathroom." My entire world stopped. I had to lean against my car or I would have collapsed. That evening, I drove straight to the police station. I told the first officer I saw everything. How Victor left my baby locked in that bathroom to die, and how he'd been doing something to her in there. But the moment Victor's name came out of my mouth, the officer's expression went from concern to utterly uninterested. "So you think this Victor was inappropriate with your daughter? Do you have proof?" "Proof? I have testimonies." He locks babies in there for 30 minutes. The officer adjusted his belt, cutting me off. That's negligence at worst. File a civil suit. He left her to burn, I shouted, capturing everyone's attention. But he just shook his head. Not without evidence, he didn't. It hit me then. They weren't going to help. That night there was only one thing I could think of. I called my two best friends, Kyle and Benji, guys I'd known since juvie, and told them everything. I sent them pictures of their goddaughter, hooked up to all those machines. We met at a bar talking for hours. By 1 a.m. we were already outside Victor's rundown apartment building, with everything we needed. A stranger unlocked the main entrance for us, and once inside under the stairwell, we changed into all black. We crept up to his door. Kyle picked the lock and we slipped in. Victor woke up 10 minutes later to the cold kiss of a knife against his cheek and 3 men in black standing over him. He tried to scream, but the sock in his mouth choked the sound. I explained why we were there, and his face went even paler when I mentioned Gabriella. The three of us dragged him to his feet, not so kindly, and pulled him into his kitchen. He was crying, trying to bargain, offering us anything we wanted, saying he wouldn't snitch if we just robbed the place. But Benji just pulled out a roll of duct tape and securely taped Victor's now heavily bruised legs, arms, and midsection to his chair. He even taped his mouth shut. That's when I approached him. Now, I'm going to take the tape off your mouth, and you are going to tell me what you were doing with Gabriella in that bathroom. I pressed the knife against his neck. Then in one swift motion I grabbed the edge of the tape and ripped it off. Victor gasped, breathing hard, ragged. I pressed the knife harder against his throat, just enough for a tiny bead of blood to appear. His whole body went stiff. I leaned in close enough to smell the fear radiating off him. You're going to tell me exactly what you did to my baby girl in that bathroom. His eyes went so wide I could see white all around them. This wasn't about money anymore, and he knew it. Victor started crying harder, snot running down his face. I never touched any kids like that. I swear. I just needed them quiet when I was on the phone with my girlfriend. The words spilled out, fast and desperate. I didn't believe a single one. Kyle walked over to the counter and picked up Victor's phone. Let's check this then. Victor tried to shake his head, but he couldn't move much with all that tape. Benji grabbed Victor's head with both hands, holding it completely still while I took the phone from Kyle. I swiped through his photos and my stomach turned. Dozens of pictures of babies in that bathroom. My hands started shaking when I saw Gabriella in 3 of them. The pictures weren't sexual, no, but they showed kids crying, tears streaming down their faces. Some even had red marks on their arms, like someone had grabbed them too hard. I held the phone right in front of Victor's face, showing him the photo of Gabriella. Her little face red and scared, tears everywhere. Explain this. Victor's crying got worse and he started talking fast. She was too loud. Okay. She wouldn't stop crying, and the bathroom has thick walls so no one could hear. My hand holding the knife started shaking violently. I didn't mean for the fire to trap her. I panicked and ran. I thought someone else would get her. Kyle, meanwhile, walked over to Victor's mattress and lifted it up. A black notebook fell to the floor. He picked it up and started flipping through the pages. His face grew darker with each turn. This sick bastard kept records. He showed me the notebook and I saw dates and times with kids' names next to them. Gabriella's name was there 17 times over 2 months. Some entries said 45 minutes next to her name. My vision went red. Before I even knew what I was doing, I pulled back and punched Victor as hard as I could in the stomach. He doubled over as much as the tape would let him, making a sound like all the air left his body. Benji grabbed my arm and pulled me back. We need him awake to get everything on record. Remember the plan. I was breathing hard, my knuckles aching, but I nodded. Kyle took Victor's phone and started setting it up to record video. He propped it against the toaster, giving it a clear view of Victor's face. I walked back over and held the knife close enough for Victor to see it, but not touching him. You're going to confess everything. The bathroom stuff, leaving Gabriella in the fire, your aunt knowing about it. All of it. Victor was sobbing, gasping for air, but he started talking as I moved the knife closer. He told the camera about locking kids in the bathroom when they cried too much. He admitted he'd been doing it for 6 months. He said his aunt knew but didn't care because he was family. He talked about the day of the fire, How he ran out and left Gabriella because he couldn't explain why she was in there. Every word made me want to hurt him more, but I kept still. After 10 minutes of his blubbering confession, Kyle stopped the recording. We all stood there looking at Victor taped to the chair. Benji cracked his knuckles and said we should hurt him more for what he did. Kyle shook his head and looked at me. If we kill him, Gabriella loses her dad to prison too. Think about that. My hands were still shaking, and I wanted nothing more than to make Victor pay for every second my daughter suffered. But Kyle was right. Gabriella needed me. I walked up to Victor one last time. You're going to live, but everyone's going to know what you did to those kids. Victor started crying harder, begging us not to tell anyone. I ignored him and picked up his phone. I dialed 911, and when the operator answered, I simply said there had been a break-in at Victor's address and hung up. Kyle grabbed the notebook, and I made sure the confession video was still on Victor's phone. We moved quick towards the back door. Benji checked outside first to make sure no one was around. The three of us slipped out into the dark, immediately going in different directions. I walked fast, not running, to my car parked 3 blocks away. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine. I drove the speed limit back toward the hospital where Gabriella was fighting for her life. The whole drive, all I could think about were those photos of her crying in that bathroom. By the time I got to the hospital parking lot, the sun was starting to come up. I sat in my car for a few minutes trying to calm down before going inside. The security guard at the entrance nodded at me, just like he did every morning. I took the elevator up to the ICU and walked to Gabriella's room. She looked so small in that big hospital bed surrounded by machines. I sat down in the chair next to her and took her tiny hand in mine. The burns on her neck were covered in white bandages. Her chest moved up and down with the ventilator. I stayed there holding her hand, watching her breathe. The machines kept beeping and clicking around us while nurses came in every hour to check her vitals and write stuff on their clipboards. Around 7 in the morning, I finally dozed off in that uncomfortable chair, but woke up when my phone started buzzing nonstop with texts from people I hadn't heard from in years. The first message from my cousin just said to check the news. I pulled up the local station's website, and there it was. Victor's face, all over the homepage, with a headline about him being found beaten and tied up in his apartment. The article said he was refusing to cooperate with police and wouldn't say who attacked him, which made perfect sense since telling them would mean explaining why someone would want to hurt him that bad. I put my phone away and focused on Gabriella, adjusting her blanket and making sure the tubes weren't pulling on her skin. Around noon, Mrs. Hamilton burst through the door, her face red and angry. She pointed her finger at me, yelling about how she knew I had something to do with what happened to Victor, and that she was going to make sure I went to prison for it. The nurse, who was changing Gabriella's bag, calmly told her she needed to lower her voice or leave. I just sat there calmly and told Hamilton I'd been right here all night with my daughter. 2 more nurses came in because of the commotion, and they all confirmed they'd seen me regularly throughout their shifts, checking on Gabriella every hour like clockwork. Mrs. Hamilton stormed out, but I knew this wasn't over. Especially when 2 detectives showed up an hour later, badges out, serious looks on their faces. Before they could even start asking questions, I told them I needed to call my lawyer, pulling out Javier Nunes' business card, which I'd kept in my wallet since my last run-in with the law years ago. Javier answered on the second ring, and when I explained the situation, he told me to say absolutely nothing except that I was at the hospital, which the medical staff could easily verify. The detectives tried asking me about my relationship with Victor and whether I blamed him for what happened to Gabriella, but I just kept repeating that my lawyer advised me not to answer questions without him present. They left after 20 minutes but said they'd be back, and I knew they were probably going to dig into my past, find out about my time in juvie and everything else. That afternoon, while I was getting coffee from the vending machine, my phone lit up with notifications from every local news app one had, all saying the same thing. Breaking news regarding the daycare fire. Someone had sent Victor's confession video to Channel 7, and they were playing clips of it on air. His tear-stained face, admitting to locking babies in the bathroom and specifically talking about leaving Gabriella there when the fire started. Within an hour it was everywhere. Shared thousands of times on social media, with parents commenting about how they always thought something was off about him. The police station started getting flooded with calls from angry parents who wanted to share their own stories about their kids. Coming home upset after Victor's shifts or having nightmares about the mean man at daycare. The department couldn't ignore it anymore, not with Victor's own words playing on repeat across every local channel and reporters camping outside the station, demanding to know why nothing had been done sooner. My phone rang that evening, and it was Rita Oakley, the fire investigator who'd worked the original scene. She said she was reopening her investigation based on this new information. She needed to examine the daycare's bathroom door and lock mechanism to understand exactly how a toddler couldn't escape from inside. And she wanted to know if I remembered any details about the door from when I picked up Gabriella before. I told her about how that bathroom door had one of those old locks you needed a key for from the outside and how the handle on the inside had been loose for months, according to what other parents had mentioned. She thanked me and said she'd be in touch once she had more information. And I could hear in her voice that she was taking this seriously now. The next morning, I saw on the news that Mrs. Hamilton's second daycare location got shut down by the city for emergency inspection after parents started pulling their kids out and demanding investigations. The reporter was standing outside the building, showing all these parents scrambling to figure out new childcare arrangements while city inspectors went through both buildings with clipboards and cameras. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. But when I read it, I knew it was Kyle using a burner phone, saying he was going to visit family out of state for a while and to take care of myself and Gabriella. We both knew what he really meant, that he needed to get far away from here in case the police started connecting dots about who might have paid Victor a visit that night. 3 days after the video went viral, the prosecutor's office held a press conference announcing they were filing charges against Victor for child endangerment and involuntary manslaughter. The prosecutor explained that while the confession video itself couldn't be used in court since it was obtained illegally, it had led them to find enough independent evidence, including witness statements and physical evidence from the daycare. 2 days later, my phone rang at 6 a.m., and it was Benji saying the cops were at his door, asking about Victor's assault. I told him to call his girlfriend first and make sure she'd back up his alibi before letting them in. By noon, he texted that they'd released him after his girlfriend swore he was with her all night watching movies, and the neighbors confirmed seeing his car parked there since dinner time. We all knew she was lying, but she stuck to her story, even when they pressed her about specific details and timelines. I spent those days bouncing between the hospital ICU and the office of Javier Nunes, a lawyer I knew from the old neighborhood who specialized in keeping guys like us out of prison. Javier went through every possible scenario with me, explaining how, without physical evidence or Victor identifying us, the cops had nothing solid to build a case on. He said the key was staying consistent with my story about being at the hospital all night, which the nurses had already confirmed multiple times. The security footage from the hospital parking garage showed my car arriving at 11 p.m. and not leaving until morning, giving me an alibi that would hold up in court. A week passed and I was holding Gabriella's hand, like I did every morning, when her fingers twitched against my palm for the first time since the fire. The movement was tiny, but it was real. I called the nurse immediately, who paged the doctor. He examined her for 20 minutes, checking her reflexes and responses to different stimuli before telling me not to get my hopes up too much. Small involuntary movements were common in coma patients, and didn't necessarily mean she was waking up. But it was still the first positive sign we'd seen. That same afternoon, Rita Oakley called to update me on her investigation into the daycare's physical structure. She'd gotten a warrant to examine the bathroom where Gabriella was found and discovered the interior door handle had been broken for at least 6 months, based on rust patterns and paint wear. The mechanism that should have allowed someone to unlock the door from inside was completely detached and hanging uselessly behind the handle plate. Mrs. Hamilton had signed off on 3 different maintenance reports acknowledging the broken handle, but never authorized the repair because it would have meant closing that bathroom for a full day. Rita said this added premises liability to the criminal charges, since Mrs. Hamilton knowingly maintained a dangerous condition that prevented escape. More daycare workers started reaching out to investigators now that Mrs. Hamilton couldn't threaten their jobs anymore, since both locations were shut down. Maria gave a sworn statement to the prosecutor's office, detailing 17 separate incidents where she tried to report Victor's behavior to Mrs. Hamilton. She had dates, times, and even showed them text messages where she documented her concerns to protect herself legally. Another worker named Sandra came forward with photos she'd secretly taken of bruises on babies' arms that matched the grip pattern of adult hands. She'd been too scared to report it before, but now she handed over her phone with dozens of pictures spanning 8 months. Victor got formally arrested the next week. Javier heard through his connections at the courthouse that things went bad for him immediately during intake. The other inmates found out he hurt kids within hours of him arriving at county jail, and by that first night, he'd been beaten so badly they had to transfer him to the medical wing. His face was unrecognizable, according to the intake photos Javier managed to see, with both eyes swollen shut and his jaw potentially broken. They moved him to protective custody after that, but even there he wasn't safe, because guards would accidentally leave doors unlocked, or look the other way when certain inmates needed to use the same hallway. 2 weeks later, the detective investigating Victor's assault came to see me at the hospital while I was sitting with Gabriella. He pulled me into the hallway and told me they were closing the case due to lack of evidence and Victor's refusal to cooperate with the investigation. Victor wouldn't identify his attackers and claimed he couldn't remember anything about that night, probably because he knew testifying against us would mean admitting what he'd done to those babies. The detective looked me straight in the eyes when he said they had no leads and no witnesses willing to come forward. And the way he said it made it clear he knew exactly what happened but didn't care enough to pursue it. The next morning I watched the news, showing Mrs. Hamilton getting arrested at her house for child endangerment and failing to report abuse. The cameras caught her trying to cover her face with her jacket as they walked her to the police car in handcuffs, while reporters shouted questions about how many children were hurt under her watch. Seeing her in cuffs felt like some kind of justice, but it didn't fix Gabriella's brain or bring back the daughter I'd lost to the smoke and flames. Within days of her arrest, a group of parents filed a massive civil lawsuit against the daycare company and Mrs. Hamilton personally for negligence. An intentional infliction of emotional distress. I joined the suit, even though I knew money wouldn't undo the damage or make Gabriella whole again, but at least it might cover her medical bills and the specialized care she'd need for the rest of her life. 3 weeks after we'd visited Victor in his apartment, I was reading to Gabriella from her favorite book when her eyes suddenly opened for the first time since the fire. My heart jumped. I dropped the book, calling for the nurses while trying to stay calm and not scare her. But when her eyes focused on my face, there was no recognition there at all. Just fear and confusion as she started crying and trying to pull away from me. The nurses rushed in and had to sedate her because she was thrashing so hard she might have hurt herself. And I stood there, watching my own daughter scream in terror at the sight of me like I was a stranger who meant her harm. The next morning, the neurologist called me into his office and pulled up Gabriella's brain scans on his computer screen. He pointed to these dark spots all over the images and explained that the lack of oxygen had killed huge sections of her brain tissue. The parts that control speech, movement, and basic thinking were mostly gone. He told me straight out that Gabriella would never walk again, never talk again, and would need someone to feed her through a tube for the rest of her life. My hands started shaking as he went through the list of what she'd lost. She couldn't control her bladder or bowels anymore. She'd need special equipment just to sit up without falling over. The child who used to run to me laughing when I picked her up from daycare was gone forever. A social worker came in while I was still trying to process everything and started talking about state facilities that could handle kids like Gabriella. She had brochures for places that looked like hospitals where they'd keep her in a bed all day with other brain-damaged kids. I pushed the papers back across the table and told her, no way was my daughter going to one of those places. She tried explaining how hard it would be to care for Gabriella at home, but I didn't care. I'd figure it out somehow because she was still my baby, even if her brain was mostly dead. That afternoon, I got a call from the prosecutor's office, telling me Victor's trial date had been set for 3 months out. His public defender was already trying to argue that Victor had diminished capacity from stress and shouldn't be held fully responsible for leaving Gabriella in that bathroom. Hearing that made my blood boil so bad. I had to hang up before I said something that would get me in trouble. 2 weeks later, I was signing discharge papers to bring Gabriella home when a guy I knew from the neighborhood pulled me aside in the hospital lobby. He told me Dexter Guthrie, this violent guy doing time for nearly beating someone to death, had become Victor's new cellmate. Word was spreading through the jail about what Victor did to those babies, and Dexter had kids of his own on the outside. The guy said Victor probably wouldn't make it to trial and asked if I wanted to pass along any message to stop it. I just shook my head and walked away without saying anything, because Victor made his choices, and now he could live with the consequences. I quit my job the next day since Gabriella needed round-the-clock care, and there was no way I could afford a nurse. Money got tight real fast with all the medical bills and equipment we needed. Lisa and some other parents from the daycare started a GoFundMe that raised enough to cover the feeding pump and special wheelchair. Every morning, I'd wake up at 5 o'clock to prepare Gabriella's medications, crushing pills and mixing them with water to push through her feeding tube. Then I'd change her diaper, give her a sponge bath, and do the physical therapy exercises the hospital taught me. Her arms and legs were getting stiffer every day from not moving on their own, so I had to bend and stretch them to keep the muscles from locking up completely. 2 months after the fire, I was watching the morning news while doing Gabriella's exercises when they announced Victor had been found dead in his cell. The reporter said he'd been beaten to death by his cellmate Dexter over some dispute about commissary items, but everyone knew that was just the official story. They showed Victor's mugshot for about 10 seconds before moving on to the weather, like his death didn't matter at all. I kept doing Gabriella's leg stretches and didn't feel anything, except maybe a quiet relief that we wouldn't have to sit through a trial. Within days of Victor dying, Mrs. Hamilton's lawyer contacted the prosecutor about a plea deal. Without Victor to blame everything on, she didn't have much of a defense left. She pleaded guilty to child endangerment and got 5 years in state prison, though everyone knew she'd be out in 2 with good behavior. The local news barely mentioned Victor's death after that first day, and nobody seemed to care that he was gone. His own family didn't even claim his body, so the county had to bury him in the cemetery they use for homeless people and criminals nobody wants. I started learning all of Gabriella's new needs, like how to clean the feeding tube so it wouldn't get infected, and which medications had to be given at exact times. The occupational therapist showed me how to position her in the wheelchair, so she wouldn't get sores from sitting in the same spot. Every day was exhausting with constant diaper changes, tube feedings every 4 hours, and exercises that seemed pointless since she never got better. 3 months after everything went down, Kyle showed up at my door with a toolbox and some wood planks. He'd been laying low out of state since that night with Victor but came back once it was safe. He spent the whole weekend building ramps for Gabriella's wheelchair and installing grab bars in the bathroom. We worked side by side for hours without ever mentioning what we'd done to Victor or how things ended up. He helped me rearrange the living room to fit all of Gabriella's medical equipment and built special shelves to organize her medications and supplies. Benji showed up a week later with his pregnant girlfriend and asked if I'd be the godfather to their baby. I said yes right away, even though part of me worried his kid might someday need the same kind of loyalty we'd shown each other that night with Victor. The civil lawsuit against the daycare moved forward over the next few months with depositions and meetings with lawyers. Hamilton's insurance company finally offered $2 million to settle everything rather than go to trial. 7 families would split it, which meant my portion would cover maybe 5 years of Gabriella's care if I was careful with every penny. I started taking Gabriella to a special needs daycare 3 mornings a week once she was stable enough. The staff there actually knew how to handle kids with brain injuries and feeding tubes. They had special chairs that supported her head and nurses who checked her medications. It let me work part-time stocking shelves at the grocery store, which helped with bills. 6 months after the fire, I was doing Gabriella's morning exercises when she looked right at me and smiled. It was crooked and probably just random muscle movement, but I chose to believe she knew who I was. The other parents from Hamilton's daycare started meeting up once a month at the community center. We shared information about special needs services and which doctors were actually helpful. Lisa brought pamphlets about state programs, while another mom knew about free therapy equipment loans. We all signed petitions for better daycare oversight and wrote letters to state representatives. The local news station called, wanting to do a follow-up story about what happened. They filmed at City Hall where new regulations were being announced, like mandatory background checks for all daycare workers and surprise inspections. The reporter interviewed me about Gabriella's progress, and I tried to explain how one person's negligence destroyed my daughter's future. The city council scheduled a hearing about funding for childcare oversight and asked me to testify. Standing at that microphone was terrifying, but I told them about finding Gabriella in that bathroom and how she'd never walk or talk normally again. The council members took notes and promised to consider increased funding, though I knew promises meant nothing. A full year passed with Gabriella slowly getting stronger. She could track objects with her eyes now and seemed to recognize my voice when I talked to her. The physical therapist said it was remarkable progress considering her initial prognosis of total vegetation. Her feeding tube still got infected sometimes, and she had seizures that required emergency medication, but she was alive and fighting, which was more than the doctors expected. Hamilton got released from prison after serving 2 years of her 5-year sentence. The parole board decided she wasn't a threat anymore and needed to care for her elderly mother. I found out through the victim notification system and spent that whole night pacing my apartment, wanting to track her down. But Gabriella needed me here, and revenge wouldn't fix her brain damage. Hamilton left the state within days, according to the prosecutor who called to warn me. At the special needs daycare, I started noticing another parent who was always there when I dropped off Gabriella. Her name was Kelly, and her son had similar injuries from abuse at a different facility 2 years ago. We started having coffee in the lobby while our kids were in therapy sessions. She understood things other people couldn't, like how exhausting it was changing adult diapers on a child who should be potty trained. She knew about the guilt of being relieved when they slept through the night because it meant a break from the constant care. Kelly showed me tricks for preventing bed sores and which generic medications work just as well as the expensive ones. Her son could use a communication board with his eyes to say basic words, which gave me hope Gabriella might learn that too. We exchanged numbers and started texting about doctor appointments and therapy progress. Sometimes we'd meet at the park with our kids in their special wheelchairs and watch other children play on equipment ours would never use. It wasn't dating exactly, but having someone who understood this life made everything slightly less impossible. The daycare staff mentioned Gabriella was responding well to music therapy and suggested I play songs at home. I bought a cheap speaker and played kids' songs during her exercises, which sometimes made her eyes focus better. Every small improvement felt huge, even if she'd never be the toddler who used to run around my apartment laughing. Kyle stopped by occasionally to help with repairs or bring groceries when money was tight. He never mentioned that night with Victor, but I could see the guilt in his eyes when he looked at Gabriella's feeding tube. Benji sent pictures of his new baby and promised to bring her by when she was older, though we both knew that might never happen. Life became a routine of medications and therapy appointments and insurance fights and small victories that nobody else would understand. One morning, the prosecutor called to tell me they were creating a special unit for daycare abuse cases because of what happened to us. She said they were calling it Gabriella's Law around the office, even though the official name was something boring with too many words. I hung up, feeling like maybe something good came from all this pain. The months turned into a year, then another, with Gabriella making tiny bits of progress that felt huge to me. I was changing her diaper one afternoon when she looked right at me and made a sound I hadn't heard in 2 years. Dada. The speech therapist, who was there for her session, dropped her clipboard. She rushed over and listened as Gabriella said it again, clearer this time. Dada. The therapist warned me this might be the only word she ever manages, but I didn't care because my baby knew who I was. That night I played the video I took for Kelly, and we both cried watching it over and over. 3 weeks later, my phone rang at 2 a.m. with Kyle on the other end, asking me to bail him out. He'd gotten caught breaking into a warehouse and needed $5,000. I sat on the edge of my bed, looking at Gabriella's medical bills spread across my kitchen table. I told him I couldn't help this time. He started yelling about loyalty and how I changed, but I hung up because Gabriella needed every penny I had. Kelly understood when I told her the next day at the park while our kids sat in their wheelchairs. She didn't judge when I admitted I probably helped hurt Victor that night he got beat up. She just squeezed my hand and said she would have done the same thing if someone hurt her son like that. We started spending more time together, eating dinner at each other's apartments while the kids did their exercises. She taught me how to stretch Gabriella's legs properly to prevent her muscles from getting too tight. I showed her the trick I'd learned for getting her son to swallow his medicine by mixing it with chocolate pudding. One afternoon, the occupational therapist brought in a new device that tracked eye movements. She spent 3 hours teaching Gabriella how to look at pictures to communicate basic needs. The first time Gabriella looked at the picture for water when she was thirsty, I wanted to throw a party. 2 weeks later, she figured out how to string pictures together to make simple sentences. She looked at love, then daddy, and I lost it completely, crying harder than the night of the fire. because she could finally tell me how she felt. The director of the special needs daycare pulled me aside one morning to ask if I wanted a job there. She said I was already there every day anyway, and they needed someone who understood what these families were going through. The pay was terrible, barely above minimum wage, but it meant I could stay close to Gabriella all day. I took the job immediately and started the next week, helping with feeding times and diaper changes for 6 other kids with similar injuries. Time kept moving whether I wanted it to or not. 3 years had passed since the fire, and our life had found its own weird rhythm. Gabriella would never walk or talk normally, but she was alive and safe and knew she was loved. Every morning, I'd get her dressed and fed through her tube. Then we'd go to the daycare where I worked. Every evening, we'd come home to the same apartment where Kelly and her son would usually be waiting for us. She had a key by then and would start dinner while I got Gabriella settled. We'd gotten good at this life nobody plans for. Kelly brought up moving in together one night after the kids were asleep. She said we were already basically living together anyway, and combining rent would help us both afford better equipment for the kids. I agreed, and we found a bigger place with wider doorways for the wheelchairs and a bathroom we could modify with safety rails. The move took 2 weeks, with both of us packing around therapy schedules and doctor appointments. Gabriella and Kelly's son seemed to understand each other in ways that made no sense to us. They'd sit next to each other in their chairs, making sounds back and forth like they were having conversations we couldn't follow. One afternoon, I got a letter with no return address, but I recognized Benji's handwriting immediately. He wrote that he'd moved his family to Arizona for a fresh start after some trouble with the cops. He included a picture of his baby girl, who was walking now, and said he'd tell her stories about her brave uncle and cousin Gabriella when she got older. He said he thought about that night with Victor sometimes but had no regrets because Gabriella deserved justice. I burned the letter after reading it 3 times just to be safe. The 4th anniversary of the fire came on a Thursday, just like the original one. I always took that day off work to stay home with Gabriella, and this year was no different. I was reading her favorite book about a bunny who goes on adventures when she used her device to say something new. She looked at the picture for happy while I was reading, and I stopped mid-sentence. She did it again, more deliberately this time, happy while looking right at me. After everything we'd lost, she could still feel joy and wanted me to know it. 2 weeks after that breakthrough with the device, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end said she was Victor's mother and needed to meet me. I almost hung up, but something in her voice made me listen. She asked if we could meet at the coffee shop on 3rd Street the next morning. I agreed, even though my hands were shaking. The next day, I left Gabriella with Kelly and drove to the meeting. Victor's mother was already there, a small woman with gray hair who looked nothing like her son. She stood when she saw me, and her eyes were red from crying. She told me she'd been following the news and knew what Victor had done to my baby. She said she should have seen the signs but was too blind about her own son. Then she pulled out an envelope from her purse and pushed it across the table. Inside was $10,000 in cash that she'd saved for Victor's bail before he died. She said it belonged to Gabriella now since her son took so much from her. I stared at that money for a long time before taking it. That afternoon, I went straight to the medical supply store and bought Gabriella the best communication device they had. The new one had more options and could track her eye movements better than the old one. I also got specialized therapy equipment the insurance wouldn't cover. Using Victor's family's money to help Gabriella felt like the only justice we'd get. The device made such a difference that within months, Gabriella was using it to say dozens of words. 3 more years passed with slow but steady progress. Then a reporter called, asking if I'd do an interview for the 5-year anniversary of the fire. I thought about saying no but realized other families needed to hear our story. The news crew came to our apartment and filmed me talking about Gabriella's progress. I told them about the signs of abuse that everyone missed and how important it was to listen to kids. The segment aired on the evening news, and within days my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Other parents whose kids had been hurt at daycares were reaching out for advice and support. Kelly suggested we start a support group since so many people needed help. We began meeting monthly in our living room with 6 other families. Everyone brought their kids, and we'd share resources while the children played together. The group grew so much we had to move it to the community center. That fall, Gabriella started kindergarten at the local school with a full-time aide assigned to help her. The first day was terrifying, but she handled it better than I did. Her aide would help her use the device and move around the classroom. The other kids were curious at first, but quickly accepted her as part of the class. She'd never be like the other kids, but she deserved every chance to learn alongside them. 6 months into the school year, we had Gabriella's IEP meeting with all her teachers and therapists. Her main teacher brought up something that made me tear up. She said, Gabriella always noticed when other kids were upset and would use her device to say okay and friend to them. Even after everything that happened to her brain, my daughter still had empathy for others. The teacher said Gabriella was teaching the other kids about kindness without even trying. Kelly and I had been together for almost 4 years by then and decided to make it official. We planned a small ceremony in the park with just close friends and family. Gabriella would be our flower girl, with her wheelchair decorated with ribbons and flowers. The morning of the wedding, Kelly helped me get Gabriella into her special dress. We practiced her rolling down the aisle with a flower basket attached to her chair. When the ceremony started, she did it perfectly while everyone watched with tears in their eyes. The officiant asked if anyone objected, and that's when Gabriella used her device. She looked right at us and selected happy, making everyone laugh and cry at the same time. After the ceremony, we had a small reception at the community center where our support group met. Life wasn't anything like I'd planned when Gabriella was born healthy and perfect. She'd never walk or talk normally and needed constant care. But she was alive and safe and loved by so many people. Some nights I still woke up in a panic thinking about that bathroom and the fire. I'd go check on Gabriella, sleeping in her special bed with all her equipment around her. Seeing her there breathing steadily would calm me down. We'd survived everything. Victor was gone, and my daughter was still here fighting every single day.